Joining us now to break down the priorities of the Trump administration is White House Deputy Press Secretary Brian Morgenstern. So, Brian, I really appreciate you coming on the program tonight, right after the debate as well, because there's a lot of topics that were discussed last night that today are being discussed a little bit more in depth. But I do want to start with the issue of law enforcement, because, for example, 5 days ago, President Trump said that he did want to declare the KKK as well as Antifa as domestic terrorist organizations. And I don't think that there's anyone in the country who would doubt that he has taken a very much so pro-law enforcement approach during his tenure. So coming out of the debate last night, I want to ask you, what are the White House priorities to addressing some of this unrest in American cities?
Well, the president has been a very loud voice on this subject, very strong voice, speaking up for law and order, offering any federal resources that may be needed by state and local authorities to restore peace in the streets, whether that's federal law enforcement personnel or National Guard, whatever it may need. And we've seen it work in a number of instances, and we've seen other instances where the local authorities reject assistance and that doesn't work and it leads to more violence. And so any suggestion that the president would stand with people who are trying to sow chaos is just flat out wrong. And unfortunately, we see some on the left and in the media trying to peddle that fallacy. But the president is a leader on law enforcement. That's why so many law enforcement organizations have spoken up in favor of him and his policies. And he will continue to do that. The other side, unfortunately, is claiming Antifa is some kind of idea. And ideas can't light buildings on fire. They can't disrupt buildings. They can't threaten and cause harm to people in the streets that we're seeing, just as Attorney General Barr has cited. So the president is taking this seriously, and he will continue to do so, and he will always be offering whatever the federal government can do to restore peace.
And I think you bring up a good point. It's the National Guard troops, for example, when they were applied to Minneapolis or Portland, we did see that unrest come to an end. I mean, we saw a little bit more peace, whereas in some states, for example, such as Wisconsin, where Governor Tony Evers rejected that assistance, we saw Kenosha literally go up in flames in some parts. So I think that there is a clear message there that there is assistance being offered by the White House that, for some reason, some of these Democratic lawmakers are not taking up on that offer. But you also bring up the idea of law and order in a big picture. And right now, it seems like we can't talk about that subject without going to the very, very top of the law type of category with the Supreme Court nomination. We know that President Trump this past weekend did nominate Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the high bench, and that's something that we know is going to be an extensive Senate process moving forward. But I want to ask you, at what point of that process is the White House in right now? Is it a vetting process? Is it meeting with senators to make sure they're on board? What's that looking like right now?
Sure. So I appreciate the question. And Judge Barrett is really an outstanding nominee, just on a personal level. Her career as a judge, serving 3 years on the circuit court with distinction. Her record as a professor at Notre Dame is outstanding. Her academic record when she was a student, and all of her colleagues when she clerked at the Supreme Court and elsewhere have noted she's such a thoughtful and qualified person who really puts the Constitution first. Now, with that, to your question, so she's on the Hill. The White House counsel's office and the Chief of Staff's office is assisting her as needed. She's meeting with senators at this point, getting to know them, speaking about her judicial philosophy and the importance of the U.S. Constitution. So they'll be in a comfortable place in terms of vetting her past writings and opinions, and as we head into the hearings, prepared to ask her any questions that may be on her mind, so that we can have a rapid process, but also a very thorough and fair one, because that's what the American people deserve. The White House knows that Judge Barrett is an outstanding nominee, but the Senate has a job to do. We absolutely respect that, and we're going to assist however we need to go through that process quickly and fairly and thoroughly.
And it seems like we shouldn't have to go through too much in order to get there either, acknowledging the fact that she was just confirmed for the appellate bench. I mean, I believe it was back in 2017. So lawmakers had an opportunity to look at her record then, question her then, and it's the very same people who are ultimately making that decision this time around again. So I think that it's going to be hard for many Democrats to find something necessarily wrong with her after just a couple of years ago saying that she was very much so qualified for that prior position. But I do want to now pivot.
And she received a bipartisan vote. I would just note that she received a bipartisan vote. There were a number of Democrats who came across the aisle to support her in her nomination for the circuit court. So it's very difficult to then seeing her serve quite well on the circuit court for any Democrats to then come across and say, well, now we don't support, So
Right.
she's very well respected, highly regarded, and highly qualified. So we're very hopeful about this process.
And it's also worth noting that a lot of their newly found concerns regarding Roe v. Wade were addressed back in that hearing as well. And a lot of Democratic lawmakers saw that and said, you know what,
Right.
that answer suffices for me. So it's interesting that that is now a relitigated part of her record that is now being coming out in the media. But before I let you go as well, I know that a big issue on a lot of Americans' minds is the coronavirus pandemic, but perhaps even more so than that is turning the corner from the pandemic and focusing on an economic recovery of sorts. That's something that we did get to hear a little bit of last night, but over the talking over one another, I don't think the American people really got a clear answer as to the contrasting positions on that so much. So I want to ask you, from this point forward, what is the White House approach to once again getting this economy back on track to the point that it was before this pandemic?
Sure. I mean, I appreciate the question. The economy is coming back very strongly. Of course, the president talks about a V or a super V recovery, and it's really because we're seeing consumer confidence, we're seeing the auto industry come back, we're seeing home sales really going through the roof. We're seeing a lot of signs of recovery. Over 10 million jobs added back to the economy in just the last few months. We're very optimistic about the growth numbers for the quarter that we're currently going through. Many estimates have us well over 20%. Granted, there was a big dip because of the virus. We recognize that, but we're coming back very strongly. And the administration continues to advocate for targeted assistance going forward, trying to work with Congress. We're meeting some resistance there, unfortunately, but we would like to see more targeted assistance for small businesses to keep people attached to their jobs so that we don't have more unemployment. Unemployment insurance for people who are still displaced due to the virus. We're looking at potentially another round of stimulus checks for people who may really need them. And we want to get kids back in school. So we'd be in favor of not only helping people with jobs, but also getting kids back in school, because that's an important component of the economy, and getting parents back to work. So there's still some measures that we would support, but we're very optimistic about how the economy is recovering. And it's all about a safe, common sense reopening of our country. People can go back to work, they can go to church, they can go to school. If you can, socially distance, wear your mask, wash your hands, use common sense mitigation measures, protect vulnerable populations who may have comorbidities, people in nursing homes, long-term care facilities, populations of that nature. We don't want them to be exposed, but we want people to get back to work in a safe way, because this economic recovery is going well. We need to help some more people. We need to make sure that everyone is included in the prosperity of our country, just as we saw before the pandemic.
Right, and we heard Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin say that last week during a hearing, but we also heard it from Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, someone who's a little bit more independent-minded, not part of the administration necessarily. So to hear that could maybe quell a lot of concerns from a lot of people who maybe aren't necessarily fans of the Trump administration, but do want to see this country get back on track. And I think Jerome Powell provided that, and I think Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin did an excellent job laying out that vision for the American people as well. Now, at this point, it's for a lot of parents out there, a lot of people eager to get back to work, their kids back to school. That's what they're looking for. So I think that comes as good news for a lot of them as well. But Brian Morgenstern, I really appreciate you coming on the program tonight, updating the American people of where we stand moving forward. Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thank you for having me.